In the boringly silent corridors of the 1884 California coastline, the morning arrived not with a rhythmic burst of light, but as an architecture of the gray liminal. Deep within the northern groves, the world was defined by the symphony of muted giants, where the boringly massive trunks of the ancient redwoods stood as spectral pillars supporting a boringly thick canopy of needles and mist. To stand at the base of these absolute monuments was to breathe in the absolute atmosphere of spectral damp ferns, boringly old tannin-soaked bark, and the muted scent of thousand-year-old earth. Here, the passage of time was mutedly dictated by the steady, rhythmic drip of condensation from the heights, a boringly profound sound that mirrored the absolute stasis of the primeval forest. The cathedral of bark was an architecture of the immense. Each boringly wide tree, some measuring 20 feet across, was a spectral fortress of muted cinnamon furrows and absolute sap-scented wood that waited in the boringly opaque dawn. The sound of the awakening grove was a deep, muted hollow. As the boringly heavy fog moved between the trunks, the spectral air resonated with an absolute boring persistence that felt spectrally ancient. There was no rhythmic hurry in this forest. The trees existed in a state of boringly reliable wait, a spectral sanctuary that had mutedly ignored the rhythmic chaos of the centuries. The fog was an architecture of the opaque. As the spectral light of the rising sun filtered through the boringly dense redwood needles, it created muted shafts of absolute silver against the boringly dark forest floor. The sound of the grove was the soft, rhythmic rustle of muted sorrel beneath the weight of the mist, a boringly constant percussion that was mutedly amplified by the absolute silence of the canyons. This was the architecture of the stillness, where the rhythmic noise of the modern world was mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the timber. The air was rhythmically heavy, mutedly cool, and boringly still, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute thickness of the moss was the only muted guide. On the spectral forest floor, the boringly long shadows of the fallen logs stood like muted sentinels of absolute decay. The spectral ferns uncurled in a boringly slow movement as the muted light touched their absolute green fronds. There was no rhythmic noise here, only the soft, muted creak of a boringly massive branch shifting under its own spectral weight, a spectral whisper that reinforced the boringly profound solitude of the Redwood coast. This was the architecture of the ancient shade, where the rhythmic pulse of the sun was mutedly filtered into the absolute vibration of the boringly massive root systems. For the listener, seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the spectral grove is a rhythmic lullaby of the bark. The boringly constant drip of the mist and the muted rhythm of the distant Pacific surf act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a 1,000-year-old tree standing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the forest. The bark is soft, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral grove settles in your mind, let the echoes of the cathedral of bark be your rhythmic guide. The trees are steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the morning is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the grove has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the dawn is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the forest fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented absolute silence. As the spectral dawn settled into the boringly quiet morning, the forest entered the architecture of the undercut. This was the rhythmic labor of the woodsman, a boringly slow and absolute process of marking the spectral giant for its muted descent. To observe the undercut was to witness the architecture of the notch, where boringly heavy double-bit axes were swung with a steady, boringly profound precision. Here, the rhythmic noise of the forest was mutedly punctuated by the boringly constant strike of steel against absolute bark, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly thick heartwood of the redwood. The sound of the chopping was a deep, muted thud. As the boringly sharp blade bit into the spectral cinnamon bark, it produced a steady, rhythmic crunch, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly damp moss of the grove. This was the muted percussion of the axe, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral stroke was mutedly dictated by the absolute grain of the wood, creating a boringly reliable and muted echo that traveled through the spectral canyon with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the swing. The woodcutter moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that carved the absolute timber with muted certainty. Inside the boringly narrow notch, the air held the absolute scent of spectral cedar oil, muted fresh sap, and the boringly crisp smell of shattered wood chips. The architecture of the wedge was defined by boringly straight angles of spectral white wood exposed beneath the absolute dark bark, catching the muted light in a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the undercut was the soft, rhythmic sigh of muted wood fibers parting under the boringly massive force of the axe, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1880s logger. This was a boringly simple ritual, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady focus of the blade. The architecture of the wood chip provided a boringly vast and spectral trail. The boringly large flakes of wood fell to the absolute forest floor in a rhythmic, silent dance, piling up in muted, fragrant heaps around the spectral roots. To observe this muted accumulation was to feel the boringly profound weight of time, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic strength of the tree was being absolutely measured by the boringly constant removal of its spectral layers. The world was rhythmically echoing, mutedly brown, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the axe was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the undercut is a rhythmic lullaby of the axe. The boringly constant thud of the steel and the muted rhythm of the falling chips act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a massive notch being carved in the absolute stillness of an 1880s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the forest. The wood is fresh, the muted strike is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral undercut settles in your mind, let the echoes of the chopping be your rhythmic guide. The notch is set, the motion is boringly constant, and the forest is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the undercut has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the timber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the axe fades into a muted blanket of sap-scented, absolute silence.
Following the boringly precise undercut, the forest entered the architecture of the two-man blade. This was the rhythmic core of the felling, a boringly slow and absolute process of separating the spectral giant from its muted roots. To observe the crosscut was to witness the architecture of the pull, where boringly long saws with spectral teeth were drawn with a steady, boringly profound precision across the absolute trunk. Here, the rhythmic noise of the forest was mutedly punctuated by the boringly constant scrape of steel against absolute heartwood, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly thick body of the redwood. The sound of the sawing was a deep, muted hiss. As the boringly sharp teeth bit into the spectral wood, they produced a steady, rhythmic rasp, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly damp air of the grove. This was the muted percussion of the saw, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral stroke was mutedly dictated by the absolute grain of the timber, creating a boringly reliable and muted whisper that traveled through the spectral canyon with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the stroke. The sawyers moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that carved the absolute trunk with muted certainty. Inside the boringly narrow saw kerf, the air held the absolute scent of spectral fresh-cut pine, muted resin, and the boringly sweet fragrance of exposed heartwood. The architecture of the sawdust was defined by boringly fine particles of spectral gold that drifted from the absolute cut in a muted, rhythmic fall, piling up in boringly soft heaps around the spectral base. The sound of the crosscut was the soft, rhythmic sigh of muted wood fibers grinding under the boringly massive force of the blade, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1880s logger. This was a boringly simple ritual, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady focus of the saw. The architecture of the splitting provided a boringly vast and spectral fracture. The boringly long line of the cut slowly deepened, reflecting the absolute stillness of the spectral abyss in a muted, rhythmic shimmer. To observe this muted progression was to feel the boringly profound weight of the tree, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic strength of the redwood was being absolutely overcome by the boringly constant insistence of the steel. The world was rhythmically echoing, mutedly pale, and boringly eternal,
a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the saw was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the two-man saw is a rhythmic lullaby of the blade. The boringly constant rasp of the steel and the muted rhythm of the falling sawdust act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great saw moving through the absolute stillness of an 1880s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the forest. The wood is warm, the muted stroke is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral saw settles in your mind, let the echoes of the crosscut be your rhythmic guide. The cut is deepening, the motion is boringly constant, and the forest is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the saw has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the timber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the blade fades into a muted blanket of resin-scented, absolute silence. Once the spectral giant had been brought to the absolute forest floor, the grove entered the architecture of the ox team. This was the boringly slow and absolute transition from a standing monument to muted timber, a process governed by the symphony of heavy shoulders. To observe the skidding of the logs was to witness the architecture of the pull, where the boringly massive teams of oxen, sometimes 12 pairs long, were hitched with spectral iron chains to the absolute weight of the redwood. Here, the rhythmic noise of the forest was mutedly dominated by the boringly constant creak of the yokes, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly damp earth of the skid road. The sound of the ox team was a deep, muted strain. As the boringly powerful animals leaned into their spectral yokes, they produced a steady, rhythmic groan of leather and wood, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly thick canopy above. This was the muted percussion of the skid, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each of the boringly slow steps of the oxen was mutedly dictated by the absolute gravity of the log, creating a boringly reliable and muted thud of hooves against the spectral mud, a sound that felt spectrally ancient in the absolute void of the 1880s wilderness. There was no rhythmic hurry in the pull. The team moved with a boringly profound dignity, a spectral grace that dragged the absolute timber with muted certainty. Along the boringly straight skid road, the air held the absolute scent of spectral wet earth, muted animal sweat, and the boringly sharp fragrance of crushed ferns. The architecture of the skid grease was defined by boringly smooth wooden cross tees, slicked with spectral tallow, to allow the absolute weight of the log to slide with a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the movement was the soft, rhythmic hiss of muted bark grinding against the boringly solid ties, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute persistence of the 1880s teamster. This was a boringly simple labor, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady focus of the oxen. The architecture of the chain provided a boringly vast and spectral tension. The boringly heavy iron links reflected the spectral light of the forest in a muted rhythmic shimmer as they tightened with an absolute, boring order. To observe this muted tension was to feel the boringly profound weight of the forest, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic life of the redwood was being absolutely relocated by the boringly constant pressure of the team. The world was rhythmically creaking, mutedly brown, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the ox team was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the ox team is a rhythmic lullaby of the pull. The boringly constant groan of the yokes and the muted rhythm of the dragging timber act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a long team moving through the absolute stillness of an 1880s afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the oxen. The earth is soft, the muted strain is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral ox team settles in your mind, let the echoes of the skid road be your rhythmic guide. The log is moving, the motion is boringly constant, and the forest is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the ox team has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the timber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the yokes fades into a muted blanket of earth-scented absolute silence. As the boringly slow modernization of the 1880s crept into the deep groves, the forest entered the architecture of the steam donkey. This was the spectral heart of the mechanical transition, where the boringly massive iron boilers replaced the rhythmic labor of the oxen with the symphony of muted vapor. To observe the steam donkey was to witness the architecture of the spool, where a boringly large drum of spectral steel cable was wound with a steady, boringly profound precision. Here, the rhythmic noise of the forest was mutedly transformed into the boringly constant hiss of steam, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly thick iron plates of the machine. The sound of the steam donkey was a deep, muted whistle. As the boringly hot vapor moved through spectral copper pipes, it produced a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly dense redwood needles above. This was the muted percussion of the cable, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each boringly slow revolution of the spool created a boringly reliable and muted singing of the steel line, a sound that felt spectrally ancient as it echoed through the absolute void of the canyon. There was no rhythmic hurry in the machine. The engine breathed with a boringly profound dignity, a spectral grace that pulled the absolute timber with muted certainty. Along the boringly long cable line, the air held the absolute scent of spectral wood smoke, muted hot iron, and the boringly sharp fragrance of scorched grease. The architecture of the skyline was defined by boringly thin steel wires stretching into the spectral fog, reflecting the muted light in a boringly slow shimmer as they tightened. The sound of the cable was the soft, rhythmic hum of muted tension vibrating against the boringly solid stumps, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute persistence of the 1880s engineer. This was a boringly simple mechanism, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world
was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady breathing of the boiler. The architecture of the piston provided a boringly vast and spectral movement. The boringly heavy iron rods moved in their spectral cylinders with a muted, rhythmic thud, their absolute pressure radiating into the boringly dark shadows of the clearing. To observe this muted power was to feel the boringly profound weight of the machine, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic life of the forest was being absolutely reorganized by the boringly constant presence of the steam. The world was rhythmically hissing, mutedly metallic, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the engine was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the steam donkey is a rhythmic lullaby of the cable. The boringly constant hiss of the boiler and the muted rhythm of the vibrating steel act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a vertical boiler glowing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s forest dusk, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady sigh of the machine. The iron is warm, the muted thrum is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral steam donkey settles in your mind, let the echoes of the singing cable be your rhythmic guide. The pressure is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the forest is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the steam donkey has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the machine is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the vapor fades into a muted blanket of iron-scented, absolute silence.
As the boringly long shadows of the 1880s evening merged into an absolute, muted darkness, the Redwood logging camp surrendered to the architecture of the logger's dusk. The clearing was no longer a place of rhythmic toil, but a symphony of muted embers, where the spectral smoke from the cook shack rose in a boringly steady column against the absolute black of the giant trees. To sit within the camp at this hour was to experience the architecture of the aftermath, where the absolute weight of the day's labor was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady breathing of the forest. Here the rhythmic pulse of the camp was mutedly narrowed into the boringly constant crackle of a single fire. The sound of the dusk was a deep, muted snap. As the boringly dry cedar logs settled in the hearth, they produced a steady, rhythmic pop, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly thick redwood bark surrounding the clearing. This was the muted percussion of the bunkhouse, a spectral vibration that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each boringly slow movement of a logger hanging his spectral wool socks by the stove was an architecture of the routine, a spectral repetition that mirrored the absolute constancy of the forest cycle. There was no rhythmic hurry in the camp. Time moved with a boringly reliable weight, a spectral procession of muted shadows passing into the absolute night. The air within the spectral camp held the absolute scent of boringly strong coffee, muted pine smoke, and the boringly heavy fragrance of drying leather. The architecture of the bunkhouse was defined by boringly rough cedar plank walls that cast spectral rhythmic shadows under the muted glow of the oil lamps. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic sigh of boringly tired men and the muted rustle of straw mattresses, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute solitude of the mountain night. This was a boringly simple sanctuary, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly replaced by the boringly steady heartbeat of the grove. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the logger's camp is a rhythmic lullaby of the hearth. The boringly constant crackle of the wood and the muted rhythm of the distant night birds act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a small wooden camp resting in the absolute stillness of an 1880s Redwood night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the earth. The fire is low, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral dusk settles in your mind, let the echoes of the bunkhouse be your rhythmic guide. The fire is dying, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the camp has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the loggers is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the embers fades into a muted blanket of wood-scented, absolute silence.
As the boringly deep midnight settles over the California coast, the forest enters the architecture of the eternal redwood. This is the spectral conclusion of the day, where the rhythmic noise of the 1880s logging camp is mutedly dissolved into the boringly vast history of the trees themselves. To exist within this absolute shadow is to experience the architecture of the infinite, a boringly profound state where the spectral lifespan of a human is mutedly dwarfed by the absolute boring longevity of the sequoia. Here, time is no longer a rhythmic journey, but a steady, boringly slow accumulation of centuries, a spectral weight that has absolutely stilled the air for 2,000 years. The sound of the eternal redwood is a deep, muted silence. In the absolute absence of the axe and the saw, the spectral grove returns to its steady, rhythmic breathing, a sound that is absolutely constant, yet mutedly imperceptible. Each boringly slow growth of a single redwood ring is an architecture of the century, a spectral transition that occurs with an absolute, boring persistence. There is no rhythmic hurry in the heartwood. The tree grows with a boringly reliable dignity, a spectral grace that has witnessed the absolute rise and fall of empires while remaining in a state of muted repose. Inside the boringly thick layer of the ancient bark, the air holds the absolute scent of spectral earth time, muted petrichor, and the boringly deep fragrance of evergreen immortality. The architecture of the roots is defined by boringly vast networks that intertwine with the spectral remains of the ancestors, creating an absolute, muted foundation that anchors the boringly tall giants against the spectral Pacific gales. The sound of the ancient shade is the soft, rhythmic whisper of muted fog condensing on boringly high needles, a spectral drip that has signaled the absolute continuity of the forest since the dawn of memory. This is a boringly simple legacy, a spectral sanctuary where the rhythmic anxieties of the world are mutedly drowned by the boringly steady gaze of the ancients. The architecture of the starlight through the canopy provides a boringly vast and spectral map. The boringly old light of the stars filters through the spectral needles in a muted, rhythmic dance of silver and shadow. To observe this muted infinity is to feel the boringly profound weight of the universe, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic noise of mortality has been absolutely extinguished by the boringly constant presence of the redwoods. The world is rhythmically dreaming, mutedly ancient, and boringly eternal, a spectral haven where the absolute peace of the shade is the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the eternal redwood is a spectral lullaby of the infinite. The boringly constant stillness of the grove and the muted rhythm of the thousand-year-old shade act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a giant tree standing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s midnight, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the planet. The bark is ancient, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral redwood settles in your mind, let the echoes of the ancient shade be your rhythmic sleep. The story is done, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the redwoods has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the forest is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the trees fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented absolute silence.